Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous, and welcome to this panel discussion highlighting the supply chain for electric batteries that will power a transition to a sustainable transportation. I want to start by acknowledging that here in the city of Toronto, we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and which land continues to be home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, whom we recognize and thank for welcoming us here today. As Catherine said, I'm Laurel Broughton, CEO of Invest in Canada, and on behalf of the entire organization, I am pleased and honored to be moderating this morning's important panel at the Toronto Global Forum. While I am only in my third week on this job, I am no stranger to today's topic, and I'm excited to be taking on this important mandate and to be speaking to all of you today. It's a real pleasure to be back in Toronto, having lived and worked in Toronto for many years and having had the privilege to serve in the Ontario Cabinet for close to a decade. I am so pleased to be back here again and to be among many familiar faces and to meet some new faces as well. So, read any headline, watch any newscast, it's obvious that around the globe, every country, every community, every company is navigating the tremendous challenge of our transition to net zero. And that is certainly the case here in Canada. At the same time, however, we are seized, all of us, by the momentous opportunity that this awakening offers to Canadians, to our communities, and to our planet. And at Invest in Canada, our team has supported many global companies who are setting roots in Canada as the complete electric vehicle ecosystem continues to be built very rapidly, I might say, and very dramatically here in Canada. This session is titled Building an EV Battery Supply Chain for a More Sustainable Future, and I know it's going to be a great discussion. But I want to set just a bit of context. Electric vehicles, and we talked about this in the green room, are perhaps the most significant transformation in mobility in this century. Decarbonizing the transportation sector is one of the most important things that we can do to combat the reality of climate change. And Canada, I'm proud to say, is right at the center of this generational opportunity, and global companies are choosing Canada to make these investments. I think we're attracting the investments that will form the bedrock of a sustainably, responsibly sourced Canadian and North American supply chain of EVs. So these are just a few of the reasons why today's discussion is so important, and I want to dive in. I want to let you know who's up here with me this morning, because these are three leaders in the industry, and I think they will each bring a unique lens to the important discussion. Thomas Schaefer is the Vice President of Global Lithium Business Development for EcoBat. Based in the UK, EcoBat is a leader in the critical recycling component of the battery supply chain, the piece that ensures we can truly have a sustainable industry. Welcome, Thomas. Marissa West is President and Managing Director of General Motors Canada. GM has not only been a vital bedrock of Canada's automotive industry for many decades, but the company has also made crucial investments in the battery supply chain here in Canada and has committed to manufacturing fully electric vehicles here. I think they're helping lead that transition to EVs here in Canada, in North America, and around the world. Welcome, Marissa. Trevor Paul is the Chief Mobility Officer for the state of Michigan, where he oversees a team leading on the future of mobility and electrification. So great panelists. Let's dig in. Let's start with supply chain. Canada and the United States share a tightly integrated North American supply chain in the traditional automotive manufacturing industry. It's well known, and perhaps some in the audience have already heard this statistic, that an average auto part crosses the border between Canada and the United States 7 times before it finds its home in a vehicle. There's a well-established vehicle manufacturing sector here, the 4th largest in the world, and there are over 700 parts suppliers in Canada's auto manufacturing ecosystem. So when all of you look ahead and you see the size of what we have built, how do you transition that to our new EV world, and how do you rebuild that integrated system? And maybe I'm going to start with Marissa, and then we'll dive into the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Laurel. It's a great question, and important point to make is the integration between the Canadian automotive industry and the US automotive industry. And as we look to lead in the electric vehicle future, one of the things that is fundamentally important is establishing that strong, sustainable, and scalable battery ecosystem. And so we recognize a huge opportunity to, transport those materials across borders. It's actually a good part of the reason that we are excited about our POSCO joint venture in Bécancour, Quebec, where we're going to be processing cathode active material. That location was selected for some very specific reasons. One of them is the accessibility to the logistics. So you have water, you have rail, and we have 3 battery plants already announced within the US, and we know that there are going to be more so that we can achieve the scale of battery production that we're going to need to support the all-electric vehicle future. Also, another selling point of that position there in Quebec was the low emission power generation that we're capable of in Canada and the low cost. So it's a really good proof point of how Canada can be integral to the battery ecosystem, and there's a lot more to go because we're on the onset of creating that. But again, the scalability is of utmost importance. That's so that we can get the number of electric vehicles that we need to really achieve our goal of eliminating tailpipe emissions in our light duty vehicles by 2035. That's a commitment across North America. And so I think we start with making sure that we secure everything from the critical minerals to the processing, establish that capability within North America, and then of course we have the battery plants that feed the assembly plants. So you start small at critical minerals and go all the way to our full-scale electric vehicle plants like we're going to have in CAMI right there, Ingersoll here in Ontario.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pull Trevor into the discussion and jump in on the establishment of a fully new integrated supply chain, but maybe put the flavor on it in terms of what role does government have to play? What role do private-public partnerships have to play? Sure. Because industry can't do it alone.
I'll bring the flavor.
Okay, good. Yes.
So I want to kind of start at a foundational level. You need to get electrification right if you want to do connected, shared, and autonomous technology right at scale. In a place like Detroit, you hear electric, autonomous, connected, and shared. You think those are descriptors of vehicles, right? The truth is they're foundational platforms that are changing every industry. Industry is converging. When we define mobility, automotive is not mentioned. But it doesn't go the way that we want in our lifetimes if we don't get the next 10 years right as it relates to electric vehicles. I think from a public sector perspective, you get excited about the opportunity. In a few years, the mobility industry is going to be $3.3 trillion. But vehicles are only going to be a portion of it. There are data, services, and everything else that maintenance, the whole life of the vehicle goes into that amount of money. So that's exciting. But then at the same time, in a place like Detroit, we just did some research. Over 300 Michigan companies are going to be impacted by the transition from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. That's about 45,000 workers that are all along our supply chain. So one of the things that we can't decouple from this conversation is the workforce and making sure that we have the folks needed to whatever Canada can bring us. Our 96 of the top 100 suppliers that are doing work in Michigan's automotive industry, we can deliver, whether that's critical materials or anything else that comes our way. So really, when you think about the public sector and government, it's all about the people.
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to bring Thomas in because we've been talking about we need the supply, we need the critical minerals. And EcoBat plays a special role in that because it brings another layer of where are we going to get that from. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about that because that's a whole added layer that now needs to be built and should be built.
Yeah. So one of the strongest arguments against electrification is that inherently it's an unclean process because you need to go through the process of mining the materials, sourcing from different locations that don't have the highest ESG standards. And the question that we need to, or the problem that we need to solve is how do we retain the materials that we've already retrieved from these sources that are not desirable, how to retain these in the supply chain and make that a circular economy. And that's where the recycling element comes into play. Of course, the focus materials are lithium, cobalt, and nickel. You can point across various regions on the map of where those come from, but really where are they processed? So the recycling chain starts at the end of life of the vehicle, but it really needs to progress all the way through, which is where we see a lot of collaboration in Canada and in the US for the downstream processing, refining those crushed and sorted batteries into sulfates or other usable types of chemicals, and then further processing that into usable battery materials. It's an enormous supply chain challenge because there are several very high capital, very technically challenging steps that need to be achieved, but the wheels are in motion, and now it's a question of how do we enable this economically to make these more desired materials versus the virgin mine materials that are the primary source today.
No, that's really critical. And I was just thinking about, from your perspective, Marissa, president of GM Canada, and yet you have to think much, downstream. How are we getting these things? Which I think for our audience must be a little bit of a different lens of the thought process that you at GM Canada have to be able to ultimately meet your production commitments, how downstream you're thinking as to how are we going to have this to build for the future.
Absolutely. So it's also critical that we make sure we have the capacity achieved, and we have to think about that long before we're ready to actually build the vehicles, because of course there's an extraordinary amount of development time. And so we've been working on it for years. We've been investing. By 2025, we will have invested $35 billion in the transformation of the automotive industry to the all-electric future. But it absolutely starts with critical partnerships to establish where are we going to get the minerals. We've taken the approach to vertically integrate, which means we're going to own the battery capability, manufacturing technology, so that we can have that sustainable, stable ecosystem for the batteries. But it's you can't just go and buy one off the shelf, right? This takes a lot of research and development. So we're really proud at GM Canada. We have over 1,200 engineers at our Canadian Technical Center, and a large number of them are actually working on developing the controls that help to make sure that we're optimizing the energy output and the management and care of these batteries, because that's fundamental to both maintaining the life of the battery while it's in the vehicle, but also, we've recently partnered to continue the research and the development of the recyclability, because as Tom says, we know that we're going to have a huge number of these batteries when GM alone is going to have 1 million electric vehicles by 2025, and then it just is exponential from there across the industry. And so the reusability of the material within the battery is absolutely going to become fundamental to sustainment of the industry. So it's a huge point of where we are and need more research and development.
For sure. Trevor, I'm going to come back to you. You promised to bring the flavor, so I want a future flavor perspective. Catherine's last announcement was about the students thinking about ideas. I want to expand more, because I think our audience would be really interested in the pieces that you were talking about. This is a panel about e-vehicles, but that more integration to an entire system. Yeah. Give us a little bit more on that, because I think it's something that is perhaps the next panel next year when we come back, we're going to need to talk about that.
Sure. So I'm going to give one example. I mean, there's a myriad of examples we could go with. What gets me excited about battery recycling beyond what it can do to fight climate change are the business models around it. We have really all over North America dealership networks that are dying, that need to figure out what their next move is to make revenue. And we were talking prior to this panel about the opportunity for the dealership to be the new hub around battery, where you would go to essentially hand off your battery after 10 to 13 years in, it's ready to go. And I think about like that moment in time, that customer service experience, how if it is a good customer service experience, that ultimately can lead to other things. So when I think about the workforce of tomorrow, bringing it back, I think about these technologies being very much in engineering mode right now, but at some point there's going to need to be a skin on them, a way to make money. And I would like, while we are very much focused on STEM education, I would like to begin to spend a little bit more time and resources and dollars in how to communicate, educate, car buyers, communities on how to handle these things. And then ultimately, how are you going to do this in a way that doesn't cripple a small to mid-size dealership network by simply plopping down this battery recycling pickup point or whatever you want to call it. All the great industries start with really great science, but then ultimately need to work for everyday people, and everyday people need to understand it. And I think we're at the point in the evolution where we need to be focusing way more on that last part.
Yeah, very good point. I'm going to bring you in, Thomas, and just talk about how do you start to get to this future state where the battery recycle, from your perspective, is fully integrated, and is there a capacity to fully integrate it in, and will that be something that will be able to, be connected to the entire supply chain?
Yeah, I think Trevor pointed out a really good topic here, which is education. And it's really informing the consumers that while they're holding onto their vehicle, they're owning this battery pack that has inherent value in it, not just monetary value, but also in terms of supply chain value and really a sustainability value that they hold. And by informing the consumers, you're driving the economic forces to really bring the recyclability into the discussion as a total cost of ownership element, where it's being considered up front, not just okay, I'm buying this vehicle, this is the operational cost of this vehicle, this is the capital expense. Really, what do we do at end of life? How do we dispose of this properly? What does that cost look like? Or on the flip side, what is the value to me of selling that battery, selling this vehicle off to a scrap manufacturer or to or returning it to the dealer for an incentive that they're offering? Combine that with a growing volume and enabling the viable economic conditions to perform pickups at the dealership level. I think there's another level of education there for the dealerships where they know that they need to adapt to capture value from the EV supply chain because they do not require as much maintenance. They don't have the same value proposition to the dealers. So how do they generate further value downstream? Well, maybe they're acting in ways that they don't necessarily think are suitable for them today. Having that discussion at the OEM and at the dealership level really does assist in enabling a economically feasible recycling environment.
You got me fired up. Can I? Oh, you had your hand up.
Well, I just wanted to comment on how grateful I am to hear both of my colleagues here talking about our dealers, because actually it's a point of discussion where we talk about at GM, our dealerships, we really truly believe are part of our competitive advantage as we look towards the all-electric future. So there's a lot of noise out there about the direct-to-consumer and how, that's the ideal. But when you stop and think about it, the role that our dealers will play throughout the entire life of the vehicle is absolutely critical to both customer adoption, customer education, but ultimately, these new business models of the recyclability. And then the only other point I wanted to make, because as Tom was talking, it was like, yes, these customers all of a sudden have this asset at the end of life that, has a whole ecosystem and business case around it. But thinking about your electric vehicle and what you have while you're using it, all of a sudden you now have, with bidirectional charging, you have this generator, you have the opportunity to potentially power your house, but you also have an opportunity to support the robustness of the grid. And so through the bidirectional charging, energy storage that could be possible within your vehicle, within your home, you actually can control your charging. And when the grid needs that energy, you can be inputting back into the grid versus, charging it, whether you're charging peak, off-peak times. So this is another completely new opportunity that we haven't thought of our vehicles, historically as part of the solution, as opposed to, just sucking gas and burning it. It's actually now part of this whole power generation ecosystem. You know, if there's power outages, we know our infrastructure is fragile across North America, and so electric vehicles can be part of the support for that as well. So it's really exciting.
Absolutely. Please jump in.
Yeah, sorry, I had two things, now I have three. What you said. So, going back to some of my original points about education, I think that fundamentally, when you think of a car, you think of the sticker price, that feeling when you get the keys the first time, or maybe you don't need keys anymore. But I think there's a big issue with getting the consumer to realize it's not about that sticker price anymore, it's about the total cost of owning that vehicle. Like, we just don't understand that. So I'll give you a Ford example. So that when the Ford F-150 Lightning came out, the big push was it's the lowest cost to own pickup F-150 that Ford's ever produced. And no one understood that because they had no context, no benchmark of what previous models had been. I think we need to do a better job of explaining that term. Like, and you triggered that. The other thing is interoperability. So one of the big issues around battery recycling, especially when you think about, okay, you have a good car, you don't want to get rid of it. Eventually, like, you're gonna probably give it back to a dealership that sells multiple types of batteries, multiple types of models. So the interoperability between the types of batteries that you pick up, being able to, you know, have Ford, GM, Stellantis, Volkswagen all come together around these investments in battery recycling to create some standards, to create you know, efficiency will be critical. You know, and lastly, I would add, like, the way that you look at sort of the circle of life is, I think with government officials, we think about right now charging infrastructure and vehicle production. And there's that whole, that completion of the circle. I don't think we understand fully the policies that we need at a state level. I mean, we had talked a little bit about universal waste and how you categorize battery scraps. And that's a US DOT conversation, but there are certain things that states can do, and we just need to figure out what those things are. So those are my three things for you.
I got
Okay.
one that you triggered for me
Yeah.
here. So design for recyclability
Yeah.
is a catchphrase that is starting to proliferate around engineering groups, and I think it's important. Not necessarily to standardize the internal components of vehicles, because there's a tremendous amount of IP with each OEM around how they're maximizing the energy density in their vehicles and how they're getting the longest range or the most power. But as a recycler, where we really need to start focusing our engineering efforts is collaboration with the OEMs and with the tier ones designing the packs to ensure, hey, if you give us a pack at end of life, if it's not economically viable for us to recycle it, you put us in a really difficult position to enable that circular economy. So we need to make sure that we're getting ahead of the problem and not building cells into the body structure of a vehicle where it's next to impossible to separate from structural elements, which makes recycling the batteries incredibly difficult. We need to be working with a forward-looking mindset towards recycling, towards end of life, because yes, it's 10 to 12 years away at end of life, maybe a little bit longer, but that's not that far of a horizon. That's not that far off. So having that initial discussion of how do we make sure that we are enabling circularity goes beyond just the economics of it, goes beyond just the regulatory structure of it. It's really down in the nitty-gritty design and engineering work that the OEMs are doing today.
So one more add-on.
Okay, and then I
Back
gotta get
in.
back
Oh,
in.
sorry about that.
And then I gotta get
Yes,
back in.
and to what Tom said, I want to talk about the Ultium battery platform is the foundation for all of our electric vehicle portfolios. And if you look into what Ultium really is, it's a modular battery strategy. And even so, where we were looking ahead, we know that battery chemistry is going to continue to evolve. We know that we're going to get more efficient with energy usage. We're going to have innovation, and that's fantastic for our customers. But it's also important that we don't have to completely redesign our vehicle architecture. And so while maybe we didn't start it with thinking about design for recyclability, we started it for design for, sort of like in architecture evolution of battery chemistry. But the Ultium platform is very much that, where it's just a modular configuration of cells that is quite accessible, whether it's for serviceability, recyclability, upgradability. And so these are absolutely the innovations that, our industry is excited about and is actually implementing right now.
Great. Well, our time is flying by, so I want to kind of change us directions. And I want to really, so obviously the government of Canada, we've fully embraced a plan for EV vehicles, and we're thrilled at Invest in Canada to be able to doing that. Businesses, the vehicle manufacturers are doing that. But I want to take us to people, because Marissa and I were talking about this earlier. You're a busy mom of four. I have 2 teenage boys. Everybody has their life. I want to focus on the consumer, because all of this from a policy, I love policy, and I can tell that this group loves it too. But when someone's making that decision, I'm not sure that they're thinking about the things that we're talking about right now. So how do we educate the consumer, and how do we make it easy for them to make this choice for their daily life? Because at the end of the day, I love what you've been talking about, that system. But if you're a mom just trying to get your kids to soccer practice, that's not the level of thinking that you're doing in that moment in time. Yeah. Right? So maybe I'll come to you, Marissa. We'll talk a bit about the consumer. And then I don't want to leave our conversation without going back to the skills of the workforce. And do we all have to collectively do something a bit different to make sure we have the right skills? So Marissa, and then to you.
Yeah, I will be happy to take the consumer aspect of that. So the great news is that our consumers are worried about the environment. Our consumers are ready to do their part to make a more sustainable future and combat global warming, but they're not necessarily willing to compromise on their daily life and the conveniences and frankly the things that they need to accomplish and do. And so I talk about the 3-legged stool really to EV adoption, and it's not ZEV mandates that are going to get us there. It's going to be elimination of the friction, elimination of the pain points for the consumer. And so the first important leg of the stool is the portfolio. It's having the electric vehicle that suits a customer's needs. And that varies depending on your customer. So you're going to need everything from, a small compact car like the Bolt EV or EUV, or a super truck like the Hummer, and everything in between. So I like to talk about those as 2 of our sort of bookends of the portfolio. But we've recently announced the Blazer EV, the Equinox EV. These are high volume vehicles in the heart of the market. And so that's the first fundamental important thing we have to accomplish, is a portfolio that customers want that suits their needs. The second one is the robustness and the confidence in the charging infrastructure. And so a customer doesn't want to change their everyday life because they're worried about where they're going to charge their vehicle. Now, the reality is that 90% of charging is taken care of at home or at work. And so I think as customers begin to adopt the electric vehicle, they'll recognize, oh, this isn't actually how I imagined it, because you never go to a gas station again in most cases. And so there's a component of that that's education, but there's a real fundamental component of you have to have accessibility to charging at your home. If you're in a multi-unit dwelling in a city, you have to have enough electric vehicle chargers to know that you're not going to be driving around or stuck without a charge. And then the third component of my 3-legged stool is the affordability. And our Canadian consumers want to do the right thing. They want to adopt an electric vehicle. But you know what? Cost is a consideration. And so as we're on this journey to scalability and the journey of making sure that we reach parity with our electric propulsion systems to what we have accomplished with our internal combustion engines, we have to also make sure that we're able to offer the vehicles to the customers at an affordable price where we can accomplish mass adoption. And so that's going to come with the sustainable, scalable electric vehicle battery ecosystem. It's also going to, in the short term, come with some customer incentives and things that the government can support. And so everybody can, we alleviate any of those hurdles to EV adoption.
Great. Thomas, come to you on the consumer, just in terms of your world. Do you have a additional lens, a different lens than Marissa has brought with respect to the conversation we need to have with the consumer?
Yeah, I think it's, stepping away from my recycling hat for a moment. Again, I think a lot of it is education. You read articles in legitimate publications that are so heavily biased against electric vehicles that they're propagating stereotypes that are 10 or 15 years old about the reliability and the performance of these types of vehicles, and they're just not true anymore. So I think having the vehicles available, I think having a broad scope and not focusing on the extreme high end, very upper echelon of consumer is incredibly important to making sure that these are accessible vehicles and making sure that they are desirable vehicles to a greater population. I think maybe adapting how the sticker price is listed to include total cost of ownership. You are expected to pay X amount of dollars for energy over 5 years as compared to what an equivalent gasoline or diesel engine would be. And I think one thing that we need to keep in mind is that, yes, electrification is incredibly important. It has a very strong use case in a lot of applications that we're using internal combustion today. But I don't think anyone's really pushing the narrative that it needs to be only electrification moving forward. I think everyone recognizes that there's a total or complete energy solution that's a mix of available technologies in order to enable the most efficient propulsion technologies that we have available today. So yes, there probably will be diesel in 50 years.
And,
There will be hybridization continuing because it's just not feasible. Trevor mentioned, some people in Michigan are driving from Detroit to Grand Rapids every day, and that commute's not really tenable in an EV right now because you need to stop to charge.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
No, you jump in, and
Okay.
then we're going to talk about the people that work in the auto industry.
But to your point, I talk more about hydrogen nowadays than I do battery electric. A lot of the battery electric wheels are in motion, but hydrogen's a great example of maybe next year we can do a
That's
hydrogen
my next panel this afternoon. You'll have
Wonderful.
to come by.
So really quickly, range anxiety is real, and it is incumbent upon the public sector to do something about it. And not just put chargers everywhere where there's a return, but make sure it's equitable so we don't repeat the same mistakes we did with the American interstate system. And so what we've really tried to do is obviously leverage the dollars from Biden's infrastructure plan. Michigan got 110 million, but also set goals. We want 100,000 chargers in the state. We have 10 million people. We want 2 million EVs on the road by 2030. And that includes rebates and making sure with every rebate, it's not just for the vehicle, it's also for charging equipment in your home. It means multi-use dwelling policy that allows for, regardless of where you live, to have a fair shake. And even at the city level, if you think about and Kroger's an American grocer, there may be Kroger's up here, I don't know. But they have an issue because they want to put chargers in, but because of the size of their stores in certain cities, they need to have a certain number of parking spaces. But the charger takes up a large portion of the parking space. So how do you marry that? There's tension. To innovate, you have to pay a fine. So we view charging infrastructure, eliminating range anxiety. Someone should be able to drive anywhere in our state, even if it's the Upper Peninsula, and not have to worry. And even what happens after the charger. So one of the things we're doing in North America is we're building out a road in Detroit where the road charges the vehicle as it's in motion. And this works for delivery vans, transit vehicles. And we'd like to see that be something that you see as standard in a few decades at industry parks. So that way productivity isn't lost and the case for fleet adoption is made.
Yeah, interesting. So give me a sense about the people that currently work in the automotive industry. Excited or anxious about this transition? And how do we keep them front and center, as I think you rightly said, we absolutely need to do, because that is a skilled workforce, and we want to evolve it to this next generation of vehicle.
Yeah. Actually, you might have a better lens than I do.
Well, I can say excited is important. So one thing, we have a very broad population of employees, of engineers, and the transferability of skills has been profound. And so we didn't need to, retire out all of our internal combustion engine engineers and hire all new talent. However, we do need to keep hiring all of the new talent because the future really is predicated on, the diversity and innovation. And so to continue to do that, of course, and in fact, it's one of the reasons that, GM Canada has a presence in Markham, is because we recognize the ecosystem that we have right here in Toronto with our fantastic universities and the skill set, the capability of software engineers, artificial intelligence, machine learning. So I would say that the graduating employee population is incredibly excited about the future. They have a mindset of sustainability. They have a mission. They want to be mission driven in their careers, and they want to have an impact on the world. So that's fantastic. They're very excited. They're very capable. And I'll tell you, software and controls is a huge part of our future. It's a huge part of how do you use the battery. The population that we already have within our company, I like to say physics are physics. Chemistry is chemistry, right? And so these fundamental skills that you have learned through your engineering, and then the experience you gain working in the auto industry, we've seen extensive transferability of skills. Most of our leaders within the electrification space came from a conventional internal combustion engine. So I will tell you, we need the diversity at all angles. So the experienced engineers, the new enthusiastic software engineers, and that talent. So there is no shortage of opportunities. Actually, it's more a shortage of talent right now that we're seeing as we're looking at this inflection point to the future.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing as well. There's jobs, there's just not people to fill. But you bring up a good point. And I mean, if I think of a catalyzing moment, it was when GM announced it was going all EV. Like that set the tone, at least in Michigan, I think, for people to take that really serious and realize if you're in the auto industry, it was just no longer about pumping vehicles out or doing what your dad did. You were going to save the planet. You're still saving the planet. And so for that rally cry, now is something you think about every single day you come to work if you're at GM or any other automaker. And that's a whole new level of excitement and meaning. And that's what people want at the end of the day. They want meaning.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing, just to complete the loop on the value chain here. A lot of people are concerned about electrification reducing the amount of jobs because it's a more efficient process. It's less moving parts, et cetera. In reality, getting to that final end product of an EV requires an incredible amount of engineering talent. And then on the back end, I mean, Ecobat has a team of PhDs, chemists and material scientists working on optimizing the recycling process. So that value chain in terms of talent requirements continues throughout the entire life cycle of the vehicle. And it's not just, when you talk about an EV, a lot of people think of tech and autonomy, programming and software, but there's a lot more beyond that. There is a lot of chemistry. There's a lot of really, I would say, hard sciences and hard engineering that goes into these vehicles to optimize their power output and maximize their range and efficiency. So it extends greatly, and I think it enables a very technically trained workforce to continue to grow and develop here in North America.
Great. Well, I see our clock is starting to count us down towards the end of our time. So I want to do 2 lightning rounds. I want to talk first about what are the things that keep you up at night? What are the biggest challenges, R&D or otherwise? So we're going to do that. And then we're going to conclude on a very positive note about what are you most excited about. So we'll do 2 quick rounds and really dig into the challenge, but then we're going to conclude our discussion with something very aspirational and positive about what is the most exciting thing. So I'm going to start with you. What keeps you up at night?
Keeps you up at night. A 3-month-old, the election, and that we didn't do enough. Like, we look back in 2070, 2080, and we literally didn't do enough from either the private sector perspective or the public sector perspective. And I think unique to Michigan and the industrial Midwest is we didn't do enough to help the people that built the industry up to this point. We create a worse Detroit than a better Detroit. We will again, if we don't act and be hungry, we could see what happened in the 70s where, the traditional Detroit muscle was in many ways outworked and outclassed by the Asian automakers. And luckily, I think we have GM and Ford and Stellantis that are doing some of the most innovative, production innovations, but also investing. And I mean, GM has a marine investment. Being vertically integrated. This was lightning, wasn't it?
This is
I'm
lightning.
Like, sorry.
Not on the lightning.
All right.
Come over here, and then I'm going to come to you. What keeps you up at night?
Sure. For me, this is a little technical, but it's out-of-network, end-of-life vehicles. Every OEM wants to retain the material that they've already invested in. That's a given. We know that we want to work with the OEMs, they want to work with recyclers in order to recover this material. But what happens when that vehicle has sold 2 or 3 times and it's out of juice? It doesn't have any more life in the battery. What does that consumer do with the vehicle? They're probably not going to bring it back to a dealership. They'll probably bring it to a junkyard or sell it to somewhere in Central America. And then what happens to that vehicle? So having an ability to recover a very, very high percentage of end-of-life batteries that, from an ICE perspective, are really just lost today. How do we do that, and how do we maintain control over the materials that we've already invested so much in?
Great point. Marissa.
So truthfully right now, and I hope it's a short-term problem, but it's that we can scale the infrastructure as fast as we can scale the vehicle production. I know how fast we can scale the vehicle production, and I see that it is outpacing the scalability of the infrastructure, particularly in Canada. So that's what keeps me up at night at the moment. I think it's solvable through partnerships and innovations. And again, I hope that we focus on enabling the partnerships, the innovations, and not the regulatory environment, because the electric vehicles are coming. I promise you that. So let's make sure that we create the ecosystem to make sure that it's frictionless for customers.
No, and that's a great challenge that you're giving us, because obviously at Invest in Canada, that is a part of our role, to go out, look around the world, find the partners, to get them here, to build up that infrastructure and that end-to-end supply chain, and we're focused on it. So we feel, we're bringing lots of interesting people to the table to have those conversations, because we fully understand the urgency of it, that it needs to happen quickly to meet Government of Canada commitments, to meet your own corporate commitments. All of us need to be pulling in the same direction. So now we really will do a lightning round, because we are really getting low on time. So what is the thing that you are most excited about in terms of the future of the EV vehicle world? I'm going to go this way and come this way.
I'm just excited to see how the industry matures, and how, after we accomplish all of these educational steps that we're talking about making and developing the infrastructure, how are we enabling recovery of these materials? Ecobat is the world's largest battery recycler. Our core business is lead acid. 40 years ago, people were throwing lead acid batteries into landfills because there was no economic way to recover them. Today, you get a new battery, it's just automatic. It goes away. Where does it go? It goes to one of our smelters to recover the material. I want to see something like that happening in the electric vehicle industry.
Great. Marissa.
So at the risk of sounding biased, and my product development background, I'm most excited about the portfolio. I'm most excited about seeing our streets flooded with our awesome electric vehicles. We've got the Cadillac Lyriq, we've got the GMC Hummer EV, we've got the Bolt EV, all of those in production. And then I can't wait to see our BrightDrop Zevo 600 that will be built right here in Canada, transforming the delivery industry.
Great.
I'll be quick, I promise. The thing I'm most excited about is sort of the democratization or the affordability of this technology, in concert with how it's going to fundamentally change our cities, from the air above to sort of how we move, how we operate, even just the volume of our cities. It's going to be a really exciting time, I think.
Well, this has been a great conversation, and I think back in time to almost 17 years ago, I was Minister of Environment, and I brought the North American Canadian auto sector together, and I can tell you we weren't having as engaged a conversation about electric vehicles at that time, but we were understanding the impact of climate change in our province, in our country, and we knew we needed to do something about it. So we just fast forward to this conversation. I'm so pleased and privileged to be able to lead Invest in Canada, be part of this conversation, and do this on the leading edge. And as we were coming to the end of our time to talk, I thought about that's kind of the theme. At the end of the day, we are coming. Time is of the essence, both on this conversation and in terms of what we need to do. We need to do more, pull together, and I think, I would encourage the industry and all of you to signal to us when you have concerns about this is not moving fast enough. We need this to make sense, because for someone who's spent a long time in and around the periphery of government, we need those early warning signals, because the Government of Canada is absolutely committed to move this ahead. to see the investment, to put in the policies, but sometimes we don't know about that really friction issue until it's almost too late. So for those of you who are really engaged in this conversation, let us know about those things and be part of this journey with us. And I can't thank the three of you enough. We knew we'd have a ton to talk about, and I hope that we gave the audience a lot to think about from a whole bunch of different perspectives. But please join me again this afternoon, because I will be talking about hydrogen, and maybe you'll come along and see what we're doing there. Again, thank you to this amazing group, and thanks for taking the time to come to this event and let us dig under the hood, I guess, so to speak, and see what's really behind the development of the industry. Thanks so much.